So I'm going to be going over how to essentially set up your module or whatever Unity project you're going to be going over and putting animations with the animation system that's already present in Unity. This is really good for if you have no idea really how certain math problems equate to that, or if you just don't want to be messed with when it comes to trying to animate via code. This is a really handy way to actually be able to do that without having to learn how to do stuff with like quaternions or anything like that. So the main things that you need to have at least just set up before you can really start actually doing the animations first is you need an animation controller actually on the roots part of your module, and also you will need an animation controller. Those two things. The first one is a component that needs to be on there. So if you select your main prefab, let's just pretend that this is my module. So in here, this is actually supposed to be a holdable, so mine's going to look a little bit different, but not by much. The only main difference that I have is that mine has KM holdable, whereas yours would have KM module for your purposes. The animator component that I talk about is this right here. So you need to have this component on to be able to use this system. As for the controller, that will go in here after you make it. And all the rest of that stuff can actually just kind of stay the same. As far as I am concerned, in my practices, I haven't actually had to change any of those since I haven't actually done anything with actual player characters, which is, I believe, what that is mainly used for. So, to actually make that animation controller, it's just like you would make anything else. You can right click in your assets, create an animator controller. The animator controller is what you would use. Not animation, those will be made a different way later. All of these that I have in here right now, all of these are actually animations, and they were made via the way that I will go over later. So, once you have those two things set up, ready to go, after you make it, just make sure that you take that animation controller and drag it up into here. It does not actually need to be any specific ordering or anything. Just make sure that those two things are set up before we try to do anything. So, for the sake of purposes, I'll show you this. The reason, also another thing that you should probably also have set up, if you don't have easy access to the animator tab like I currently have pulled up, or the animation tab that I have right next to it, I recommend getting those roughly in the same area so that you aren't looking multiple different places. Hell, you can have them 2 different tabs if you like. Organization is completely up to you. Just make sure you have access to those tabs, as we'll be kind of flipping back and forth between them a little bit. So, once you have those set up, you'll notice that if you click the animation tab, it'll say like no animatable object selected. It's because I unselected the module or my holdable itself, so it thinks that there's nothing that I can currently animate. So if you click that, you'll see that this shows up. Mine's going to look a little bit different since I already have animations. Actually, here, I'll do this for now. Let's go back one. I'll just make a new one real quick. Animated controller, gun. And I will put that on instead for now. And you'll see that mine changes a little bit. This is what you should more or less be seeing. You shouldn't have to really do anything with layers because you're only doing the one thing. You're only going between essentially 2 different states, either on, off, true, false, night, day, yin, yang, however you want to phrase it. You're just going between those two, so yours is going to be most likely very simple if you're just doing like a button animation or something. So, when you first go into animation with your animatable object selected, it'll say, hey, to begin animating this, you need to make an animation clip, or otherwise known as that animation. Similar like what I was talking about earlier, and all of those animations that I was talking about earlier as well. You'll see those. So if I go back and actually make a folder so that I don't clutter my stuff, new animations, and I'm just going to drop that in there so I don't lose it. So now if I go up into here and create one, it'll pull it up like, hey, do you want to make a new one? And say if I just want to do a trigger pull, or no, I'll do animating the hammer because that's something I can toggle, so it'll be very close. So I want to do hammer pull. Hammer pull animation. Cool. Now you'll see that an animation clip got made. You can see it here. Also, you'll see that it automatically got selected in here as well. But this animation has no properties, so if I try to call it, it's not actually going to do anything. Unity has zero information as to what to do with this right now. So what we need to do is actually tell it first what we want to animate, and then tell it how we want to animate it. For those that are not familiar with animation as a whole, that is generally done through what's called keyframes and a little bit of interpolating, yeah, there we go, interpolating between those keyframes. And there's a few different lines and whatnot that you can use to tweak that. So I can either be a fluid motion, it could be a straight motion, whatever that looks like. Just feel free to tweak it as necessary. Now, pretty much everything under your root is going to show up in this add property list. The few things that probably don't make sense to have actually in this, such as your scripts and so on, but the main things we're looking for is these. So in each of these, you'll see is active, transform, and other things nested underneath it. So this transform applies to the whole thing. This is active is essentially if I toggle this up here. It's whether it's visible or not, and everything underneath it as well. So if you want to move the whole thing, like the root transform, that is also able to be done as well. As for what we're trying to do, or at least what I'm trying to do, I want to animate my hammer, so I'm actually going to find the slide, and I have, no, not the slide, somewhere in here, here we go, hammer. So I'm going to find the hammer, the transform, and I'm doing a simple rotation. I'm rotating around the y-axis, so I'm actually just going to find the rotation and add that. You'll see that it already has 2 keyframes. Generally, I like to actually double the size of samples that I have. Samples essentially being how much a second is divided, give or take. This is so that I can be a little bit more specific, essentially. Up here, you'll see essentially a keyframe at the very beginning and a keyframe of what is essentially the end of your animation. I'm going to pull this over to be about a second, just so that we have plenty of time to work with. And you can see how mine's kind of divided into hundredths now. It's generally divided just into tenths. So, if you hit this drop down, you'll see how these are actually broken down. If I look at this keyframe for this specific X value, this is as if you're changing that actual local transform up here. So if I don't do anything and I play this animation, nothing happens. It's just gonna be chilling, essentially. So what we want to do is actually say if I want this to just be resetting the hammer, right? What I'm going to do is actually take this, and if you don't want to do fudging with numbers or anything like that, what you can do, what you can essentially do is select that that specific value, hit record, and just move it like this. So I wanted to move it up like that, for example. It looks a little bit funky, but it still works for my purposes here. Cool. Stop recording. And now, if you'll see that that value itself should be changed. So when I move back and forth, now it actually moves. Because it remembered that value of A, where it was, and what I moved it to. That's more or less literally all it takes to make an animation. And you can do this for any animations that you actually need to make. So like if I put in my other one again, so you can see that, you'll see that I have a lot of animations already made for it. So like if I take this one, you'll see that I have an idle animation specifically for it being decocked. I have an idle animation for this because I was doing some other things. So a lot of mine currently are actually going to just be idle animations because I was trying to do things with a bunch of different in-betweens and whatnot. But for example, my trigger wiggle here, it's essentially just a pulling of the trigger, allowing the weapon to cycle. You'll see that it pulls it up and then immediately puts it back into spot. If you want to do something like this, essentially, instead of doing what I did before and modifying one of the two starting keyframes, what you can do is actually like find where you want that middle keyframe to be. You can make a keyframe, and then you can modify that keyframe specifically, and be it moving it further up, down, wherever you want that to be. And now, since those two are identical, they kind of hang on that for a little bit. If you want to see the curves themselves of this animation of how it's going about these changes, there's also a tab down here, and you can see those a little bit more in depth, provided it actually wants to change. Since this is a very minute change, you kind of actually have to zoom in a little bit to be able to see it. But if I zoom in far enough, you can start seeing how that's changing. And you'll notice how even though these two keyframes are the same value, since it's interpolated, it kind of goes up a little bit and then down. Anyway, alright. The next thing you need to do is actually pull up Visual Studio, because even though you haven't made the animation via a script, or it's not being animated via a script, you do still need to call it via a script, which is actually really straightforward, to be honest. I'll pull up this. I should have actually probably had Visual Studio up already, otherwise I have to do all this, because I've recently installed Windows. We'll be back in a second. Cool. Now that's done. So, outside of that, the main thing you need to do actually in this is just like how you would kind of prepare. Oh, nice. It made a dark mode because that was my last setting. Pretty much just like how you would for your KM selectables, declaring those and this, or how you would make a private boolean, things like that. You kind of do the same thing. You still need to declare your animator as a variable that you will be referencing so that it knows what that component is, just like it needs to know what this KM selectable is so that if something happens to that KM selectable, your code knows what to do with it. If you're trying to call your animator, you still need to have that in your code so you can reference it. It makes it a lot easier at least. Outside of that, you'll notice that I have all of these for the various different various different animations that I might want to either reference or different values that I want to reference. So say if I want a certain animation to happen when a certain variable hits a certain thing, I can have a variable in the animator actually tracking what that is, and then have that animation play when it gets to that point. Or you can just have your variable be in the code, like say if it's ammo and mag, you can have your code be, it can be a local variable in your code, and then that will trigger the animation and so on. You get the idea. I have this specifically so that I can see it in Unity. That shows up here, and I can see that change when I was testing it. It makes it a lot easier than having to search the console for certain variables as well. It's actively there, and I can see what's changing. Outside of that, what you will probably be actually doing doing is a trigger variable. And essentially what that means is it will fire and immediately become false, or you would be using a boolean. You already know what a boolean is if you've gotten this far, most likely. Uh, the main thing that this, the main things that I would use for, and the main things that I've used in this to demonstrate those two things is fire is my trigger and chamber is my boolean. That is what I will be using for this purposes. In update, I have, for my purposes, I have these in update because I constantly want to actually see if they've changed. Chances are you don't actually need to do this, but this is a very good way to, if you want to do this in your testing to see what is what, to see if proper things are triggering as they should be, that is up to you. It's been a while since I've looked at this. I don't know why I actually have this in here. You could probably get away with not actually doing that. If you're trying to call your animations via script to get them to fire, essentially what you'll need to do is I have set trigger has to fire because every time that I want to try and fire it, it's going to move the trigger in some way, or at least try to. And then that goes a lot more into the logic of actually how this is trying to run, but that's not important for this. The main thing is that just whatever your Unity variable is supposed to be, make sure it's being called properly here. If you're trying to call a trigger and you're setting it as a boolean, chances are it probably will yell at you. So, outside of that, that's really all that this is going for. A lot more complicated stuff for what I was actually trying to do, since this is a very, very unique project. But assuming that you've done all of that setup correctly, at least, when you go back to Unity and you let it compile for a second, if you've changed anything or as you change things, you should be able to hit play. Mine's not going to be, mine's my own little test harness that I did. As soon as I try to fire this, the trigger should actually either try to move or it should move, something to that effect. So you'll see how this moves. And you'll see how a lot of these actually try to shuffle around a little bit. Notice how not any of this is actually kind of referenced in code or anything. It was literally just essentially watching variables like my bad, I'm forgetting a step. My apologies. So we're gonna back up a little bit. Rewind to just before we went into Unity, not Unity, back before we went into Visual Studio. We actually need to go to the animator. I'm gonna put my other one back in real quick so that I can show you what that looks like, because we actually need to tell Unity what to do, essentially. So we have our hammer pull. Essentially, all of this window is saying that, hey, I'm starting at this point. This is my doorway. This is, no matter what, when this game object is instantiated in Unity and it starts moving, if it's active, I want this to, it's starting here. This is the beginning of the maze. And the first place it's going to go, provided that this is true, well, it's going to always be true here because you can't stop here. This is not an animation, so it's always going to go here. But say if we had a second animation, we'll just make an empty animation real quick. Idle animation. It's not going to contain anything because this is purely for the sake of purpose here. So notice how this one's not actually connected to anything. If I right click this, make transition, I get that little arrow like I have here, and I can click this. Now, the difference between these two is this one doesn't do anything because, like I said, this entry point, this is not an animation. But with this one, since we're going from one animation to another, we actually have something we can do here. Now, mine's not actually going to look like it's doing anything because this animation is empty. But if I set this, say, to, I don't have any parameters, but this is essentially where your true or false starts happening. If I start adding in parameters like, hey, I want a trigger called fire, and it's only going, oh, come on, back up. This is only going to go if fire happens. It will hold at hammer pull, or here, I'll do this a little bit backwards. Let's delete this one real quick so that it goes to this. And then create, we'll drag in hammer pull. So we'll make that transition here instead. Cool. So we're going to essentially set this to have fire. All right. Well, here, let's get those triangles out of here. All right. Idle, one arrow, and then hammer pull. And we'll set fire back into that. And essentially, now what we'll do is have it go back, and it essentially through this loop, it'll start idle. It's not going to do anything. As soon as we hit fire, it'll run the hammer pull animation, and then it'll go right back to being idle again, is what it should do. So, what we're going to do is come in here, and make sure that that's actually called fire. Yeah, cool, it is. So now, if I hit fire, it should kind of actually do the hammer pull thing. See how it moves a little bit, and it goes right back to being idle. This will continually try to play this all of the time until fire is actually there. I was being a brainlet when I originally recorded this. The two settings that are currently on screen are what you have to set as low as possible to get it to stop cycling. To actually remove the delay completely, you just need to shorten the actual length of that idle animation so that it's not a whole second. If you have any time for that idle animation, that's how long that timer will go for. If there is no time in that idle animation, it will essentially hold that pose for however long until the next trigger fires. Back to the video. There we go. Alright. If you set this to not have a transition duration or an exit time or anything, or a ridiculously small exit time, then this will pretty much just fill and it'll wait for that next transition. So now when we hit fire, it'll do that, and it's not going to actually have a transition. It'll just play the animation and go back to its idle spot. Currently for us, it's in a bit of a weird spot, but more or less, if you have at least two like this, it will fill that bar. Chances are, if somebody's playing this module, unless they literally go in as the lights turn on or as the screen fades in, this bar on Unity's backend side will have already filled. You shouldn't run into any issues like that. So if we come in here, hit this, you see how that bar pretty much is full immediately. You would essentially do this if you're trying to have something be able to be repeated very quickly. I'm currently limited by the speed of the hammer pull animation itself. It still plays for like a whole second, but realistically I'd have that very quick. So, back to the Visual Studio bit. Like I was saying earlier, you can declare them like this so that you can easily reference them. If you don't do this, that just means that you're putting a string in there, like right in here, which I personally don't like doing the quotes all the time, so I did this. It's a lot easier for me to look at, but it's personal preference. Essentially, you're just doing set trigger or whatever that might look like. I have these. That's why I have these, is so that I don't have to essentially call each of these individually in the code itself. Essentially, I'm changing their variables respectively in the code rather than calling these or checking and then calling them. They're just constantly looking to see if their variable that I'm using is changed. All right, that makes more sense to me. Cool. So, just as a recap, essentially, to make animations via Unity, what you need to do is, on your main root game object, the same place where you have your KM module, KM holdable, whatever that is that you're trying to make, even a game room, you essentially, the same place wherever your KM holdable or KM selectable or KM module is the same place that you need this little animator component as well. In addition to the animator component, you need to create an animator controller. This essentially functions as a book of animations. Any animations that you need to call for your module. For me, if I need to animate my slide, my trigger, my hammer, my slide, I said slide twice, my safety trigger or my safety lever, any of those things, I would have an animation for those. They would be in this singular animator controller. It doesn't matter how many animations you have, so long as it's on this one object, I want that one controller. You can nest it further if you would like, but that gets into the grounds of having to call different animators. You might start losing track as to what animation is under what controller. It just makes things a bit more complicated. For the sake of modding in KTaNE, I highly recommend you just keep them all under one controller. There shouldn't be any harm in that. Once you have those two things set up, essentially you'll come over into the animation tab with your root game object, wherever that animator is, and you will essentially start making your animations as clips. You make a new animation, test, make it, you can select it from the list. Once you have it selected, if you need to swap back and forth between your animations, you can hit them from this drop down. When you have your new animation clip, add property for whatever thing you're trying to animate, be it if it's, for me, the magazine, I want to modify its position. From there, you can essentially modify these keyframes. You can modify however fast it's going to be. I want, say, a keyframe here, and I'm going to then move this down a little bit. Well, I selected the whole thing. Don't want that. So we're actually just going to only select the magazine itself real quick. So just the magazine, and slide it out a little bit. And then now if we stop recording, you'll see how this just moves in and out a little bit. Like that. And that's more or less this animation. We'll change that to fire instead. Well, we'll change the text to test actually. So, oh wait, no, here. So here, instead, we'll have this go here. Delete that. If you need to delete any transitions, you can just select it and hit delete like you would this. And we'll make this a loop real quick. Create this. And we want it to pretty much go right into test. So, and now if we come into here, and now if we pull the trigger, rather than doing stuff with the hammer, it'll just slide the magazine in and out really quickly. So now this goes back to like what I was saying, how I was limited by the speed of the animation for the hammer. Now that I've made the test animation a lot shorter, it plays just that much faster. And I can click the button a lot faster. I do still recommend, based on however long your animation is, have something to prevent people from spamming it if you have the animation be repeatable. This would prevent possible changes in your code before the animation gets done playing. Because the thing that I ran into with this is if somebody were to spam fire the weapon, the animation would still be playing, it would still be cycling. So I needed a way to prevent it from doing anything while it's still going through its animation, however quick that may be, so that the values were still consistent throughout the animation itself. So like say I wouldn't hit 0, but the animation itself would still show as it being loaded or anything like that. So if you have a lot of animations that need to play at the same time, I would recommend having some way of limiting input until the animations are done cycling whatever animations need to actually finish playing. Beyond that, like I said, just calling it in the code is as simple as set trigger or set bool, whatever type of parameter you have set in Unity. I'll show what those look like real quick. So if we select gun and we go to, oh, we're still in play mode. If we go in here, you can see how this is int, this is float, and here is the bool. These are the different parameters. Whatever parameter you're trying to call, that is what you will essentially pre-fill for this part after set. So set bool, for example.